Hello and welcome to this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. Today we'll be discussing the Middle East's latest conflict and its consequences for the region itself, Europe, Ireland, and the global economy, with four speakers capable of bringing a vast array of expertise on different angles of the discussion. Rory Montgomery is a former Irish ambassador to the EU and a holder of one of the pivotal roles in the Department of Affairs as political director. Laurence Norman is deputy Brussels bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, who has followed the Iran nuclear program more closely than any Anglophone journalist that I know of. Michael O'Sullivan is an author, economist, and advisor on the intersection of investment and geopolitics. And Paola Rivetti of Dublin City University is an Iran specialist. We'll go in reverse order today and start with Paola. So with that, let's discuss, first of all, Iran itself. Paola, Iran is the second most populous country in the region. For the past 45 years, it's had a theocratic regime. How big an impact has what's happened over the past 2 weeks and over maybe a year or so in terms of the conflict with Israel? How has that affected the legitimacy and durability of the regime, in your view?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So the so-called 12 days war, of course, had a huge impact, both internationally and domestically when it comes to the politics of Iran. I would say that internationally, probably the long-lasting consequence has to do with trust building between Iran and the international community. I know probably people will talk about this later on, but it is important to notice that the Israeli aggression happened in a time when Iran and the U.S. were engaging in negotiation over the nuclear program, and certainly one of the biggest lessons that the regime has taken away from the recent events is probably that perhaps negotiations with the West do not really matter that much and protect territorial integrity and sovereignty. So this is, of course, something that the regime will have to cope with, and the international community as well will have to cope with in terms of finding a way to get diplomatically to the Islamic Republic and manage the development and the management of the nuclear program of Iran. Domestically as well, we have seen important development, especially when it comes to a country that has been going through a lot. Let's not forget that just 3 years ago we had Women Life Freedom Movement, which was actually an uprising, countrywide uprising, where we have seen, in a way, the extent to which the legitimacy of the regime is questioned, if not, totally denied by the people to the state. And of course, what we are seeing today in Iran is a kind of, dynamic, which is in itself contradictory, but we will have to wait and see in terms of how it will play out. Because on the one side, there have been some people who are, who have been, also, if you want, considering the regime at least partially responsible for an aggression in terms of its international politics and regional political decisions and role that has been playing recently. But of course, we also had a different and opposite dynamic where we had a sort of rally around the flag process or effects to the aggression and then subsequent war, where we have seen even within the opposition, so the very democratic opposition that has been demonstrating against the authoritarianism and the policies of the Islamic Republic, condemnation of the Israeli aggression, a rejection of the war and kind of foreign intervention as a means for liberation, which has been, a narrative that we have heard a lot coming from Washington, from, and from Tel Aviv, of course. by saying that that Iranians are well able to self-liberate and liberate themselves because they do have political agency. So we will see how these two kind of contradictory dynamic will play out. But I would say that, from what I'm seeing, from what colleagues and other analysts are seeing as well, from what what I read on social media and conversations and so forth and so on, we are definitely seeing this situation where the regime is struggling to cope with a crisis, of legitimacy, which is ongoing. But at the same time, there's very fierce nationalist, if we want, sentiment and pride that is prevalent among the civilian population.
Great, thanks, Paola. We'll come back to sort of scenarios that could play out. Mike, go to you. One of the things that hasn't happened remarkably in this crisis is energy prices. Energy prices are back below $70 a barrel before where they were 2 weeks ago, around where they were 2 weeks ago, lower than they were on October 7, 2023, when the latest bout of violence erupted in the region. What's going on in oil markets? Does the Middle East not matter anymore?
Hi, Dan. Hi, folks. So, and just to add to Paula's point, actually, I think many Iranian people are wary as well as what happened in the Arab Spring and how the Arab Spring ended up. And that's yet another barrier, I think, to push back against the regime. On the economic side, I might just say three things. And the first one relates around what I think Sherlock Holmes called the dog that didn't bark. And lots of headline writers were talking about a potential spike in the price of oil to 120. It hit about $80 on Monday morning. And I think those fears were maybe misplaced for a couple of reasons. One, there was no effort by Israel to hit Karg Island, where a lot of Iran's oil producing and export facilities are. In the Iranian riposte, there was no attempt to hit oil facilities or gas facilities in the Emirates or in Saudi. And I think any threats to close off the Straits of Hormuz would have been met with a very, very aggressive American naval attack. So I think that was something of a misnomer. I think there's maybe one or two other points to draw out from an economic and financial point of view. One is that markets generally have been very, very calm throughout this particular conflict, and actually are higher. If you look at equity markets, they are higher now than when the conflict started. And that's strange because we've seen in the last 3 months two things that have never really happened in the last 30 years. We've seen a direct conflict between Iran and Israel. We have a world tariff war. Both of those and other events tell us we're in a new disorderly world order. And I personally, as an investor, find the calm in equity markets a little bit disconcerting in that case. One thing to watch for is the dollar. Normally, when you get economic crisis, when you get geopolitical crisis like this, you go back to the various Iraq wars, the dollar acts as a safe haven and it rallies. And it hasn't done it this time. And to me, this tells several stories. The sort of at the margins, the unraveling of the view of America as the safe haven financially, economically, maybe also as a global empire. It also tells us that investors internationally are worried for a whole range of reasons about holding dollar assets, and some of the provisions actually in the forthcoming budget can potentially penalize holders of treasuries, for example. So I think behind this, there's a story about America as an actor, as a player in the world economically and financially, and the dollar is the key asset to watch here. And we've just, even in the last 2 days, the dollar has dropped 2%. The other thing to mention from a financial point of view, and that's relevant to Europe, is we tend to focus a lot on public market reactions, but the private equity and venture industries are becoming very, very big. And within those, they are becoming more and more focused on defense, on AI. And I think if you are a government in pretty much any country in the world, if you are an investor in technology, you look at what Israel has done, how that emphasizes changes in warfare. I mean, very, very powerful deployment of cyber, ruthless and devious use of tactics with special forces, and then overwhelming use of heavy technology. And in Europe, we're just on the cusp now of countries committing and then acting out increases in budgets. So actually, I think a lot of this will be played out in private markets, in private equity, in venture, investing in things like AI, multi-purpose AI, cybersecurity, and defense as well.
Okay, interesting. Lots of interesting points, but the particularly interesting final point. Laurence, you've been clearly following on a minute by minute, hour by hour basis the degree to which the attacks have put back or damaged the Iranian nuclear program. Can you give us your take as of now, the best evidence that there is?
Yes, yeah, probably second by second would be the right analogy. Look, I think the first thing to say is it's very early, and we shouldn't be too confident in what we know. I think there's a big fight going on in the US over the way that President Trump has described what happened to the program is right or wrong. And I think the truth is we do not know everything yet. So let's start with that fairly big caveat. What do we know? We know that there was serious, considerable damage, the word that Rafael Grossi, the head of the UN Atomic Agency, said today, to the three main sites, the two enrichment sites at Natanz and Fordo, and the nuclear complex at Isfahan. We know a number of buildings were taken out. We know centrifuges were taken out. We do not know if either Fordo or Natanz were completely destroyed, and we do not know if the centrifuges, particularly in Fordo, were removed from the site before the US attacked, and we do not know ultimately what has happened to Iran's considerable stockpile of enriched uranium, which had enough high enriched uranium alone for 10 nuclear bombs. So there are question marks. Yes, there was definitely damage. I think what maybe has not got enough focus is 2 points. One, the breadth of the attacks on Iran's nuclear program. This was not just about the main sites. They hit, uranium metal lines, which are crucial to produce the uranium metal lines for a warhead. They hit centrifuge manufacturing plants in several different sites. They hit the uranium conversion facility at Isfahan, which is what turns uranium into the form which can be enriched. And of course, they killed at least 11 nuclear scientists, people who've been working on this program for decades. So the breadth of the attack do suggest that this is a real setback to Iran's nuclear program. But if anyone is making a guess about how lasting this is, whether it means Iran is now 6 months away from a nuclear bomb instead of 3 months or a year away, they are guessing on the basis of imperfect information, and that is the bottom line. If I may maybe add something to the points that Mike was making on the financial impact. I think there had been this automatic assumption in the minds of many people and probably many investors that if Israel or the US attacked Iran directly, there would be a regional conflagration. I've always, certainly since Hezbollah were dismantled last year, I think that's been highly questionable. But it was the assumption. And I think markets may have quite quickly adjusted to the fact that, well, the Houthis did not strike Saudi Arabia or the Emiratis. The Iranians didn't hit them either. The US came in, okay, and then made it fairly clear it wanted to come out. And that kind of automatic assumption that was there, that a direct attack means regional war, I think people quite quickly came to see that that wasn't automatically the case. And maybe that had an effect on markets too.
Absolutely. No, it's a good point. Maybe carry on with Rory. Rory, is there a possibility that the Middle East is actually the potential for major calming down with the developments that have happened, and the exposure of Iran as something of a paper tiger, but more with your very wide experience in Europe, also what are your thoughts on how the Europeans are looking at this? Nobody's really unhappy with the situation as it stands right now, but what does it mean for Europe and Europe's influence over the region? Are we just too busy with our own difficulties here, NATO, Russia, to even try to influence the situation much?
Yes, hello, and good afternoon to everybody. I think what's striking really is that Europe as a whole and the European Union as a set of institutions are entirely marginal to this affair. And it's quite a contrast with earlier work to stop or manage the Iranian nuclear program in the 2000s and the 2010s. It was actually the Germans, the British, and the French who led on negotiations with Iran, with the support of the High Representative for Solana and Cathy Ashton. Now, American intervention was crucial in actually getting the deal in 2015, but there's no doubt, as I say, that there was a very considerable European investment in those efforts. Now, in a completely different situation, as you rightly say, I don't think anybody would be shedding any tears for the difficulties Iran is facing, and in particular, probably a great deal of relief if, and it's a big if, the nuclear program has been seriously damaged, even if not obliterated, to use President Trump's word. Of course, the American attack and the Israeli attack are both run directly contrary to all that the EU would say about the rule of law, the risks of conflict, the need for diplomacy and dialogue. But at the same time, I think you've seen, whatever people might be prepared to say about Israel and its relationship with Iran and its war with Iran, nobody wants to get on Trump's wrong side on this. You'll have seen that the German Chancellor in particular spoke very strongly in support of what Trump had done and recognized that he was doing the dirty work for others. Almost the only European figure that I've seen expressing some criticism of the American approach was Simon Harris. I hope that wasn't registered in the US. It probably wasn't. We have to believe. But the Taoiseach, for his part, was cautious and careful. And of course, the call. So I think there won't be much of a debate about the rights and wrongs of what happened. The focus will be on the future. But I think Europe's influence in this is extremely marginal, unfortunately. If you got to a point where Iran did, of course, become a rather different type of state and a more constructive, outward-looking country, then, of course, the economic dimension would become very important. But we're a very long way away from that, as Paola would rightly say. One other point I'd make, the point that Mike made about warfare and types of warfare. Yes, at the moment we see not only a debate in Europe about increasing spending, but also the nature of that spending is very much under scrutiny as well. And I think there is a sense, both that the Ukraine war and now this demonstrates that, in a way, much of what we have seen as being the traditional forms of warfare, they aren't irrelevant, they remain important, but they're supplemented by a great number of other technologies and tactics, many of which are directly linked to the private sector. So I think this will further, give momentum to this particular part of the European debate.
Thanks. Paola, coming back to you, I recall once being in the company of an Iranian who was described as an Arab, and the reaction was absolutely furious, as I hear is not uncommon. That's not to take away from Mike's point about Iranian people fearing the sort of unrest that happened in Syria and Libya. Could you describe, certainly I've heard people Iranians say that, their civilization is 5,000 years old, and they feel that a transition to something better, if the regime were to fall, is perfectly possible without major upheaval. What's your assessment in terms of how a regime collapse could play out? Is there a possibility there could be a smooth transition with the army taking over, or do you see a real risk of the country of 90 million people breaking down into civil conflict?
Yeah, I think that the answer to this question is very much linked to to perceived international security. And I think we have to be very clear, like, Iran is a country that has been, is a party to the non-proliferation treaty, has been, hosting regular inspection, has been under sanction, different types of sanctions, different regimes of sanctions for not complying entirely with with international regulations and legislation, and that's totally fair. But I think that we can't actually, the elephant in the room is that there are other countries, and in particular one, which is Israel, which is not, playing by the rule in many different respects. Let's not, forget what has been going on in Gaza for 2 years, and the different very serious pronunciation of the ICJ and the arrest warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu. So I mean, when we talk about threats, to international security, working on Iran, I often find myself in this very weird situation where there's what looks like a total, cognitive dissonance, where we're talking about, Iran as a big threat, and I'm not saying it's not, but we always forget to mention that there are other threats that actually, when we look at facts, simple, raw facts, what we see is that, like in this case, in the case of this war, definitely it hasn't been, something that that Iran kind of started. Okay, then we can have all conversations about whether, what's the percentage of responsibility and so forth and so on. But we must start from facts. If we don't start from facts, I mean, we don't understand diplomacy. We don't. What kind of foreign policies, right, are we advising for? So I think this is very important, and I really wanted to address this point also because, coming to your, to your question, Dan, what you were saying about Iranians fearing of becoming like Syrians, of their country going through this kind of intervention and external ignited regime change, like we've seen in Iran, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so forth and so on, is a big fear, and they are right to be extremely worried by this.
But Paola, can I just interrupt? But the question was more, let's just assume nobody would be crazy enough to try and intervene to bring about regime change. Let's just imagine that domestically there is a collapse of the regime, or the army takes over, or protests become so great that the regime has to kill lots of people in the streets. More on the domestic, let's just assume that nobody invades and just look at what could happen if domestically the regime were to collapse.
So, sorry, I just go back because it is important. It was linked to to address this question. The fear of becoming Syria, the next Iraq, which is about instability. Okay, is a big deterrent from Iranians has been, at least in thinking of the uprisings in 2018-19, has been a big deterrent for a huge part of Iranians that have avoided to join in the big protests because of the fear of chaos. Regime collapse I think is a perspective that is not particularly likely at the moment. Perhaps not in the next years, but we're talking scenarios here. So definitely there would be a problem in terms of guaranteeing a stability to the future political and institutional configuration that might arise from that type of situation. I don't see any of the groups that in these past couple of weeks from the diaspora have been branding themselves as the actual alternative to the Islamic Republic. Of course, the monarchists have the resources and the power to do that more with more insistence. honestly think that with all the difficulties that will definitely that would definitely be there, I do think that the only option is the internal democratic opposition that we have seen, in the streets, that we have seen participating, taking part, organizing, and so forth and so on, the different waves of mobilizations and protests that have taken place in Iran for the past, say, couple of decades, to look at the more recent past. This won't be able to happen without the international support for this genuine kind of internal progressive and democratic opposition, which looks very different from definitely external regime change, but also the forces that have been branding themselves as as the actual kind of alternative to the Islamic Republic.
Okay, Mike, you wanted to come in, and I've got a question for you, but come in with a response.
Well, why don't you fire the question down? I'd like to talk about the economy of the region, and also.
Well, that's exactly the question I wanted to come in. So, bringing Laurence's point back there about possible. The risk of a wider regional wars is lower than might previously have been thought. One of the things you and I have often discussed is this sort of theory that once people become, more involved in commerce, and the merchant class wants stability, doesn't want war. Many of the countries that you spend a lot of time in the Gulf in particular have very much moved in that direction, focusing on economic development. Is that a factor in sort of pacifying the region, making them feel they don't want to get involved in other wars, they want stability? Is that another reason to be slightly optimistic that the region is not about to blow up into some sort of wider regional wars being predicted on a daily basis now for at least 2 years?
Yeah, it may sound slightly contrarian, but I'm actually quite positive or bullish on the wider region economically. And people in the region talk about two Middle Easts, the geopolitical Middle East, which we've seen in the last 2 weeks, and then the economic Middle East. And I think there's potentially two positives can come from what's happened in the last 2 weeks. One is that Israel is convinced that an existential threat has been put to bed, and it stops its action in Gaza. The other is that the Gulf states, Saudi, become convinced that Iran will no longer be a difficult, I won't say a bad actor, but a difficult actor in the region. Iran will maybe focus on its economy. And what we've seen in the last couple of months is that behind the scenes, Iran has been much more actively talking to the Gulf states, and diplomatically relations have improved, publicly with Saudi as well. I think looking at the wider region, in Ireland, we will remember, you and I remember that in the early 2000s, policymakers from Dubai and Abu Dhabi came to Ireland to study our miracle. And if you look at how they progressed in terms of the wealth of their economies, use of AI, for example, that they're surpassing us now in a number of ways. And I think what you have in the region is the beginning of a kind of a coherent trade zone. And we're entering into this multipolar world where, China, Europe, America will be poles of economic activity and influence. And I actually think eventually the wider Middle East has got the potential to be a sort of a fourth pole. The basis for that is the Emirates. So you consider that Abu Dhabi is sort of becomes the Washington and maybe also the Wall Street of the region. Saudi is a very ambitious player. People don't talk enough, in my view, about the Indian diaspora. It's incredibly present and important in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and also the wider region. And they're also beginning to introduce a whole range of trade measures, most of which don't come with sort of strings attached. So I think if you go back to February, March last year, they were doing trade agreements with Ukraine, and then the day after they would do one with Russia. And I think in the trade environment that we have, this is probably the region that can benefit from that. And you will see more and more trade and financing activity centered here. And I think if you remove some of the geopolitical risk, that will only thrive more.
Okay, good to hear some positivity there. Rory, you wanted to come in, and I've got a question for you as well. What does all this mean for nuclear non-proliferation, something that has been an important element of Irish foreign policy over many decades?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple of points. I mean, first of all, to Paola's argument about double standards applying to Israel and Iran, she's undoubtedly correct. On the other hand, I suppose from a European perspective, Israel has never threatened Europe or European citizens or European interests in the way that Iran has in the past. So that's an unfortunate kind of reality, I suppose. Second question is, again, it was touched on the impact on Gaza. Trump, it would appear, and Qatar are pushing hard to get a ceasefire. There was, of course, a ceasefire earlier in Trump's term. Will they succeed? Who knows? And if they do, will it last? And then there'll be the enormous task of rebuilding and finding some sort of political, institutional future for Gaza. I think at the European level, people I've spoken to suggest that while it's already been it's been impossible for the European Union really to adopt a coherent, unified policy on Gaza. There's been some movement, given the appalling events of recent months. There's been some movement towards a greater willingness to challenge Israel, though a long way short of unanimity. I think these attacks will probably halt that trend, may even reverse it a bit. Like I said, the German government, which had moved some way towards that, is, I think, now more likely to feel that it doesn't wish to confront Israel at a moment when Israel has been involved in doing something as important as this. So I think it puts Ireland's rather quixotic campaign to put Gaza front and center. I think it makes it more difficult. But finally, then on nuclear non-proliferation, well, I think the assumption one has to have is that as to how effective these strikes would have been in delaying or preventing an Iranian program, well, that's Lawrence's area. I think you can read it either way. More generally, though, the lesson which I would take away if I were a country with potentially the capacity to develop a nuclear weapon would be that the sooner I could do so, the better. And I would not cooperate with those who are interested in preventing me. You only have to look at North Korea, which economically is a complete basket case. It should have been extraordinarily easy for the Americans in one way, and indeed for the South Koreans, to put Kim Jong-un in his box. That hasn't happened, of course, and the reason it hasn't happened is that we know they have considerable nuclear armament.
Laurence?
Yeah, Rory just made 4 points that I wanted to respond to, some of which are in agreement with him. First of all, he talked about the Iranian threat, past and present. I think when it comes to, he talked about in the past. I think when it comes to Europe and how they feel about Iran, it's very much also the present. The fact that above all, Iran is supporting sending missiles and drones to Russia for that war has utterly transformed the feeling about Iran. Yes, there is Israel, but it has utterly transformed the feeling. There's also kidnapped people in Iran. The mood about Iran is very, very different from the way it was even back in 2020. So that's the first point. The second point, EU leaders are talking about Gaza today. I'm in Brussels for the summit, and they will be talking about that, and they'll probably spend more time talking about Gaza than they will about Israel Iran. That's the briefing we got, and there is still this discussion about the association agreement with Israel and the way what we've been told basically to expect is the EU foreign policy chief will come back in July, and she will tell the council whether Israel has listened and is going to do something on the humanitarian aid front, and that may well affect what decision Europe makes. So there is actually a live discussion, probably a more live discussion going on about Israel and Gaza right now than there is about Iran, Israel. And then two other things that Rory said. One thing I didn't make clear before, I think it's absolutely evident that Iran still has a pathway to a bomb. I think it is absolutely evident that even if Fordo and the tanks were entirely destroyed, as long as they have a stockpile, and they definitely have spare centrifuges, we know that they have a pathway to a bomb. And that leads me to the final point that Rory made. He said the sooner the better, from Iran's point of view. I'm not so sure about that.
I didn't mean necessarily Iran. I said if you're a hypothetical country X and you were weighing up the advantages of having a nuclear weapon, that's the conclusion you might come to. I didn't. Iran's this particular case.
That's very fair. So let's talk about Iran and what they might be thinking right now. Uh, to me, Iran has always wanted either a bomb or the option of being close to a bomb. Other people will disagree with that, but to me, that is evidently clear. Um, the issue for them, and they've obviously got fairly close, the issue for them is what is the reward and what is the risk? It's a very simple calculation. And at least Khamenei has so far concluded that the risk of crossing the threshold is higher than the reward. And so they've incrementally moved towards nuclear weapons capability, uh, often through quite cleverly crafted dual use research, and they very patently increased their enrichment. We know that they have no problem on the enrichment side, but he has not crossed that boundary because the risk of being caught is greater than the rewards, which would probably be in the near future having a crude nuclear weapon that could be delivered by a truck or by a ship, not by a missile. So the question is, how has the last 2 weeks changed that calculation? And I would argue, we don't know for sure, obviously. I would argue that the reward has increased because Iran has been shown to be pretty defenseless and to have no deterrent ability really apart from its apart from its ballistic missiles at all. But the risk has also increased. Khamenei knows now that the Americans will act militarily against Iran. They will come in if they believe that there's a nuclear weapon being produced or getting close. They know the degree of Israeli penetration of their leadership and of their nuclear program. They kind of knew that before, but they really know it now. Um, and they know that probably the timeline, even if that initial report is right, that it's gone from 3 months to 6 months. 6 months is quite a long time if you are trying to develop a nuclear weapon and actually assemble something that you've never done before. If you haven't a secret enrichment site, you've got to get people there, you've got to get equipment there, you've got to do work that's never been done before. The Israelis are pretty good at spotting what you're doing. So my guess is the risk has gone up, the reward has gone up, and Khamenei, in as far as he's able to be in charge of the decisions right now, which is a question mark in my mind, will probably go back to the same calculation. Let's keep working, let's keep it slow, let's look for our opportunity. That's my guess, why I doubt they will race to a weapon.
Okay, so just putting it in another way, and you probably answered the question: is a grand bargain conceivable where they completely verifiably give up, and the US is prepared to normalize relations with the current regime? Is that completely impossible, inconceivable?
Right. No, nothing in the world of Donald Trump is completely inconceivable. I think
Yeah,
it's
but
very
Laurence,
unlikely.
the question, I suppose, is more about whether the regime would completely give up.
Yeah.
I'm sure Trump would do that possibly, but would the regime give up completely?
I think it is very, very unlikely that Iran will give up the possibility of getting a bomb. I think it is very, very unlikely. They may, however, have concluded that the damage is deep enough and their regime is vulnerable enough that they do it, or at least they do it for a period of time. I find it unlikely. And if they do it, the other part of your question was normalize relations. I don't think Congress is in the mood to normalize relations with Iran. That's different from sanctions relief. So
Fair,
I think it's unlikely.
fair point. Paola, could I come? We've very little time left. In India and Pakistan, public opinion is wildly in favor of their nuclear weapons. What's your assessment of the popular mood about having nuclear weapons in Iran?
So it's very difficult to answer because, of course, there are polls and surveys, but there's always a question of their reliability. But what I can say with confidence is that there is a widespread sense of insecurity, which is also caused by the the fact that apparently military aggression can be done with no actual sanctions. So I definitely agree with what was said before about the need for the regime to have at least the capability for nuclear weapon, and that's where and I would say that the 12 days war actually increased that need for capability because of the perceived lack of of security and safety, other than what that confidence and that sense of security and safety that might come from having the possibility to actually assemble a nuclear weapon. So this is the first point. So I can't say, but definitely there is a widespread sense of insecurity. The second point also relates to nationalism and the very strong sense of nationalism, but also the attack on Iran's territorial sovereignty and the impact of this in the direction of increasing and enhancing.
And Paola, a question, could I just to follow up? Obviously, the majority of people are Persian, but there's very many different minorities. There are some Arabs and various other groupings. Does everyone feel that sense of national, is it a glue in Iran, regardless of what your religion, ethnic background? Does it bring people together, or is it a very divided society with some groupings not feeling very Iranian and not having that sense of national identity?
So I wouldn't say it's a very divided society. The Islamic Republic has been relentless repressive of any sort of, Kurds, for instance, the different Kurdish political organizations in Iran are not asking for independence or, secession. What they're asking for is the recognition of political rights, of, just being able to speak the language, being able to exist as a Kurdish political party, very similar to what we have seen in Turkey in certain periods in the recent past. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's a divided society, but definitely the repression of the Islamic Republic against ethnic and identity demands is one of the kind of cleavages that we have to always observe and be mindful of to read Iranian politics and international politics.
Thanks. We've only got a couple of minutes. Rory, you got your hand up, but also I want to ask you about the publication yesterday of the Israeli settlements bill in Ireland. I seem to be the only person, certainly in media or social media, who's concerned that this is going to run afoul of US anti-boycott laws. Has that been thought, from what you've heard? Has that been wargamed? Has that been thought through in terms of if this becomes law, that the US in turn will activate its anti-boycott laws against Ireland?
Well, just very briefly on that, I know that this certainly was a concern for people in foreign affairs over the last year or so. The political momentum has been utterly in the other direction, as you know. As far back as 2018, I remember being in Washington and being lectured by people in the State Department, National Security Agency at the time, Security Council at the time, when the bill was first introduced by Francis Black. It has to be a risk. That's what I say. And you combine that with Trinity becoming the first university in the Western world to join in a BDS campaign against Israel. So you have to. So there's certainly a risk. My other point is simply on Israel. What lessons will Israel draw from the last couple of weeks? Obviously, it has had in reality a crushing military victory over the last year or so over Iran, over its proxies. You would like to think that might encourage it to be a little more relaxed, a little more positive about finding ways forward. And that ties in with Mike's point about economic development in the region. It was always the vision of Shimon Peres that you would have an area of co-prosperity across the Middle East. I think it's pretty unlikely with the present Israeli government, very unlikely indeed. But and I think they, with Gaza, they have their courses set, even if there is a ceasefire. But it's an interesting question. I mean, as Israel digests the consequences of this, will it feel that the environment has been altered enough to allow it to be a little bolder, and will it then resume the path of the Abraham Accords?
Laurence and Paola, if there's just a final thought you want to come in on, I know Mike wants to come in. We're almost out of time, but if either of you want to make final points, Mike, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Dan, just to reiterate the last point, Ireland is an outlier compared to its European peers on many of these issues, and the cost to that are rising. I think for all the best reasons, we have views of the world that, the world is changing. It's becoming more dangerous, more lawless, militarily intense, and I think we can't afford to ignore that.
Laurence?
Mine is very simple. Watch the IAEA and Iran. Keep an eye on that. Iran is saying no access. That could become a big international issue.
Great. Look, Paola, final word.
Apologies, I didn't mean to, but can I just a very final word? What Laurence said is extremely true. It's very important, and I think it's our responsibility to always kind of insist that international law is upheld, international regulation, but for all countries.
Okay, folks, it has been really brilliant. Fantastic inputs from you all. Thanks so much for taking the time, and really appreciate it. Wish you all a good afternoon. Thanks again.